Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel Tour update, and today is the 67th day since Islamist terrorist organizations from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched a war in Israel, committing a massacre, murdering some 1,400 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping some 245 individuals, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. As we continue to update you from here in Jerusalem, let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you update us with on the latest?
So the Israeli Defense Forces, in its operations, both in north-central Gaza and in the southern district around Khan Yunis, keep hammering away at the Hamas battalions. They have dismantled most of the battalions. They have killed most of the battalion commanders and company commanders, and in two cases, brigade commanders. The Hamas organization has not broken down yet, but Defense Minister Gallant says that it is on the verge of breaking down. What is a verge? How wide is a threshold? It's very difficult to measure. Apparently, this statement by Gallant is intended both domestically, for people who are asking this question, how long is this going on? The number of casualties starts piling up. We have heard that 13 out of the 105 Israeli fatalities in Gaza were caused by friendly fire, quote unquote. But this message was also intended to Washington. Please, don't push us. We are on the right track. Give us some more time and we will get the job done. Now, of course, the fire accompanying the ground maneuver comes from artillery, armor, the air, and also the Navy. And the Navy has just announced that the 4 corvettes, missile boats of the SAR-6 type, the newest and most innovative boats that the Navy has, originally bought in order to protect the gas derricks, but also the gas derricks, and also available for all other tasks. They are now operational. And the most important news is that one of them has crossed the Suez Canal. It is based now in Eilat and is now available for missions as far south as Bab el-Mandeb. So this is, again, one message aimed at Yemen, at the Houthis, and we will obviously see quite soon Israeli naval and perhaps air movements, maybe operations around Bab el-Mandeb.
Indeed. Of course, within that context, Bab el-Mandeb faced yet another attempt to strike, which was successful for that matter, when a cruise missile was fired at a Norwegian-owned vessel, a chemical transport vessel, and unfortunately there was some damage to the vessel. Nonetheless, both British and American vessels came to the assistance of the Norwegian vessel, and it was not sunk. Nevertheless, it does indicate the severity of the current situation there, with the Houthis working tirelessly in order to frustrate maritime shipping, not only Israeli, and that is very important to highlight. The second point, the beginning of the end, there are roughly 500 terror operatives currently that were apprehended over the course of the past month, 300 of which were affiliated to Hamas. Another 120, 130 were affiliated to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a directly funded, or we can just call it what it is. It's an Iranian proxy for all intents and purposes, and a few other terror organizations that are affiliated to other organizations in the Gaza Strip. Now, I'd like to actually follow up on one question to you, and that is time. I've received also during the course of this past week, but also this week, uh, a number of phone conversations from senior officials who keep telling me, Jonathan, why are you talking about time? This shouldn't be the focus of the discussion. Now, of course, they come from a uh, senior practitioner's perspective. Nonetheless, when we're looking at this, time is ultimately something that should be within the necessity of what the ground forces, the Air Force, and the naval forces require in order to fulfill their objective.
It all has to do with optics, with the media. If it's no longer in the news, if some other event takes precedence, or if the public gets tired or indifferent, okay, so another day in Gaza. And if there are no pictures of babies being hit, of new damage to whole neighborhoods, of refugees or internally displaced, saying to the cameras that they are starving, that they have no water, or that they are pushing towards Egypt, then there is less pressure on President Biden. And then President Biden does not push the Israeli government. So it's a chain. And if Israel is clever enough to do whatever it does without too much exposure, then the pressure will recede, days will go on, we will get to the holiday season. People in the world, at least in the Christian world, the Western world, will be otherwise occupied, and Israel could get into 2024 while still working according to its plan, at least in southern Gaza, because by that time it should be over in north central Gaza. And the wild card, what happens with the hostages? We have seen up to now two operations, one failed, to get hostages out militarily. We have seen one hostage deal. Perhaps there are negotiations behind the scene on another one. If another couple of weeks go on without any hostage, any additional hostage being released, there will be public pressure in Israel, in addition to the outside pressure, to get something done.
Let's now turn to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, Brigadier General in Reserve, Doron Gavish. General Gavish, thank you for joining us. Could you provide us a little bit of insight? There's been ongoing rocket fire, also directed from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip towards central Israel. What can you tell us about that, and to what degree has this really indicated the beginning of the end of Hamas, since they continue to fire rockets unhindered?
Well, indeed, Jonathan, we saw some rockets that were launched toward Israel, but we also have to say that looking on the statistics, and if we check it weekly, the number of rockets that are being shot toward Israel is continuously going down. But still, there are some capabilities, there are some areas that the Hamas still can shoot rockets from. Of course, we saw in the last few days that they were shooting also from humanitarian areas and humanitarian zones. But in overall, we have to say that the number is slowing down. From the other side, the vast majority of them are being intercepted. It is not a hermetic defense. There are some damages that we see in Israel. Yesterday, we saw it in the city of Hulon. But overall, we could say that at least from the defense point of view, the Hamas, from one hand, of course, it still terrorized some of our civilians. We have to go to the shelters, but it didn't really succeed in a military point of view. But the question is really not the defense, I would say, because in the defense, I think that we are constantly in this situation that we are keeping a high level of interceptions. People are listening to the orders that are being issued by the Home Front Command, and the combination of the active defense and the passive defense brings us to a very low numbers of Israelis that are being that are being hit and we're talking now about the south part of Israel, coming from the south part of Israel. In a minute, we'll talk about the north part of Israel. But at least from this point of view, we see low numbers. But the question and the win of this war, of course, would be on the offense. And what we are seeing in the last few days, and Amir said it rightly, it's kind of no news yet because Israel, basically, the IDF is pressing all the centers of gravity of the Hamas in the southern part, in the northern part, and Israel and the IDF is basically where he wants to be in this point. And now it takes time to go in and to dip the achievements of our soldiers within those areas of Khan Yunis, Sajaiya, Jabalia, and so on. In the northern part, we see more and more Hamas terrorists that are surrendering to the IDF forces. Those are footages that are coming daily in the last few days. And in the south part of the Gaza Strip, we know that there is quite a lot of achievements that are being done over there. The Division 98 is the division who is leading the fight against the Hamas in the south part of Israel. But in those days that, and we could I think we could remember that we had it also just before the kind of a turning point when the Hamas asked for a deal and to return hostages. We had few days that we didn't really know what exactly is happening within the fight. And then suddenly the Hamas was asking for this kind of deal with the hostages. So it might happen also in the south part of Israel and in the south part of the Gaza Strip. And I think it is not only the matter of the hostages, it could be even much more than this, because the Khan Yunis area, this is where apparently the leaders of the Hamas are there. And if Israel would gain control on this area, I think this would be kind of I would say, crossroad to a very significant change in the fight against the Hamas. The last thing that I would like to mention is that yesterday there was a very interesting footage, which is also, I think, related to leadership. And this is the picture of both of the commander of the IDF and the commander of the Shabak being together in the Gaza Strip, in Khan Yunis, talking with the soldiers over there. So it does say something, and we say that, this is also a war of information, and I think that the message is very strong that both of those leaders are inside in Khan Yunis talking to the soldiers. And maybe something else that I would like to mention, and this is also footages that we are seeing coming out in the last few days and mainly yesterday, is that the Hamas is trying to control some of the humanitarian aid that is entering the Gaza Strip. We see Hamas terrorists which are shooting and threatening their own civilians, because in some cases they even steal for them the humanitarian aid. And the other in the other footages that we saw, you could see that there is a Hamas gunman over the truck and basically controlling to where this truck is going. And along with this, we see more and more Palestinians which are, aiming their, I would say, bad feelings, or aiming what they feel that is happening to them for the Hamas. So I think we hear again more and more of those. Of course, this is very important. It's very important that it's being highlighted, and it also resembles some of the situation in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you, General Gavish. Let's also join the conversation with the founding director of Alma Education and Research Center, namely Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve, Sarit Zehavi. Thank you for joining us, Colonel. I'd like to ask you particularly with regard to what General Gavish mentioned about the visit to the 98th Division, or the tour of the various forces in Khan Yunis where it's not a sterile area, it's a war zone, so to speak, in full-fledged fighting. And we saw their ISA director, Ronen Bar, and IDF Chief of General Staff, Lieutenant General Herzia Levi, both mentioning the term the war of shafts, namely tunnel shafts. The fact of the matter is, most battles that are currently waged in the Gaza Strip are roughly between 15 seconds and 45 seconds, with 45 seconds being a long battle. And therefore, this indicates that those terrorists are coming out of the shafts, firing an anti-tank missile or a few barrages of bullets towards IDF troops and run away. And this is a systemic modus operandi throughout the Gaza Strip. They're not facing the IDF headstrong, and therefore, when we're looking at this situation in Gaza, is this something that we can also expect in Lebanon? And to what degree is Hamas and Hezbollah fully coordinated on this matter?
Definitely. I think that all the capabilities that we see, the tactics, the human shield tactics, the underground warfare, you mentioned the war of shafts. I think also the fact that we find that huge amount of munitions everywhere in Gaza, in the mosques, in the hospitals, underground, in the houses. This is exactly what we are going to have in Lebanon. And that's why I think that all these talkings about different diplomatic mechanisms to solve the problem, if anybody is truly believing that this could be a solution, it must include the question of who is going to go home to home, house to house, and expose all this munition that is now being exposed in Gaza, how exactly this is going to work up there in the north. But I want to say a few more points around everything that was discussed here. And first, I want to say about international pressure. We have experienced international pressure so many times in the past that eventually prevented us from finishing the mission and prevented us from winning against terror. Again and again and again, it happened in 2006 in Lebanon, and it happened in various operations in Gaza. We enabled the terrorist organization to survive because of this international pressure, and eventually, look what happened. I don't think that in this case, the international pressure is only following the picture of this child, like we've seen in '82 with President Carter, or that starving Gazian in Gaza, because as we all know, and I believe the administration knows that as well, that Hamas is still in the humanitarian aid anyway, and there are testimonies of Gazians as well that are calling Hamas to stop that. I think that eventually the pressure that comes from the United States is something that is internal to the political arena in the United States, and the fact that 2024 is election year, and this is something that is really difficult to deal with because it's not about us. It's not about what we are going to do. It's a bigger question than that. It's a question about the involvement of United States in the region, in the conflicts that are developing in the region, not only with Gaza, but also what you mentioned around the Houthis of Yemen and the attacks against the United States in Iraq and Syria. I think the main interest of international arena now is to calm things down. And we've seen this, by the way, also with the UN, when the United States was the only one to veto a resolution in the United Nations Security Council that called for a ceasefire. That again, a ceasefire means that we cannot finish Hamas, we cannot eliminate the threat, it will happen again, which is something that we cannot afford. This is around that. I want to say something about the shafts and the tunnels here. Though in Lebanon it is much more difficult to excavate, Hezbollah had much more time. Meaning that Hezbollah, we know that Hezbollah learned from the North Koreans how to adopt and adapt to underground warfare from the end of the 90s. Hezbollah military operatives visited North Korea and learned there how to fight in the underground tunnels, underground infrastructures in the end of the 90s. So if it took a decade to drill a border crossing tunnel of about 1 kilometer into Israel, well, they had 30 years to excavate tunnels also below the houses of Lebanon to create connection between the different areas of operation of Hezbollah, whether it's Beirut, South Lebanon, and the Bekaa Valley. And there may be other more underground infrastructures, just as we see in Gaza today. One last point is 1701 as a solution. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 is a resolution that was accepted to end the previous war in 2006. And because of many pressures that came from different directions, it was phrased in a way that didn't solve the problem. And actually, we hear today a lot of voices from Lebanon itself, from international arena, from even Israeli leadership that are talking about pushing Hezbollah north to the Litani River based on 1701 resolution. This resolution was never implemented. There is actually in the resolution itself, it doesn't say who is responsible for the enforcement of the resolution. The word enforcement doesn't exist in this resolution. It is only saying that UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, should assist the Lebanese army and force this area empty of any illegal weapon, meaning south to the Litani River and the Israeli border. It only says that UNIFIL can use its capabilities to make sure that this area is not used for violence, but it doesn't talk about enforcement. And again, it doesn't talk about the question, who is going to make sure that Radwan brigades are not in South Lebanon? And what's the deadline for that? For how long are we as Israelis going to wait to Hezbollah to withdraw from this area? And remember, I live 9 kilometers from the border. It should have happened 17 years ago and not discussed this today at all. And the last thing that Hezbollah is now trying to do, and we've seen this with these informal and formal speakers of Hezbollah in the past week, is that they're actually saying, okay, if you want 1701, fine, but bear in mind that you should withdraw from northern Rajah, which is a humanitarian issue. How can we withdraw from northern Rajah? These are Israeli citizens. What exactly will happen to them? Nobody is talking about that exactly. 1701, Hezbollah is saying, okay, but Hezbollah is saying we are a legitimate militia in Lebanon. This is not exactly what Israel meant when 1701 was to put down. It's not exactly a legitimate militia, but when Hezbollah is also a political party and a member of the Lebanese government, it can afford saying that, and the risk is that somebody actually will accept that. So I think that when we speak of solutions, this time we have to make sure that we eliminate the threat, whether it's militarily or diplomatically, I don't know, but we cannot be based on mechanisms that already failed.
Thank you, Colonel Zehavi. Mr. Oren, I'd like to expand a little bit also on the Northern Front, since Colonel Zehavi provided quite the elaborate explanation on the complexities that are rightfully, we should highlight them time and again. Nevertheless, when we're looking at Hezbollah, it's merely one piece in a web that the Iranians have constructed throughout this region. And therefore, when we're talking about this, we will discuss this more elaborate this evening, when we will host also the former director of the National Security Council, namely Dr. Eyal Khulata, and the former Chief of Intelligence of the U.S. Air Force, Lieutenant General or retired Lieutenant General David Abdullah. But until that moment, what can you tell us from a holistic perspective? We're dealing, of course, as you initially mentioned, also the Houthis. We're still looking also towards Syria, where much motion is currently underway, and we're seeing also Iraq and also other areas that the Iranians are quite active in.
The challenge to the global system stems from the fact that there are no longer only exclusive members of the club, member states who are part of the UN General Assembly, each having an equal vote, and 15 members of the Security Councils, 5 permanent and 10 other rotating according to their continents. Now we have those hybrid entities, such as the Houthis are not the state of Yemen, but they are dictating policy. They are acting as if they are sovereign.
Not of all Yemen, we need to highlight, because there is the southern part, which is not under Houthi control. There's the Sausa, where Queen Sheba comes from, Shaiba, and all those areas. There is the eastern part, which is closer to Oman, which is controlled by Al-Qaeda for other...
That's true, but if they are in the vicinity of the port of Hodeidah, across from Somali, and this is Bab el-Mandeb, for all practical purposes, they are Yemen, but they are not under any obligation that national units, that nation states have. The same goes for Hamas. Hamas is now Gaza, but Gaza is not a state. The Palestinian Authority is not a state. So how can you have sanctions on them or on individuals? Sometimes you do, most of the times you don't. Now, for Lebanon, Hezbollah, as Sarit mentioned, is a major force in Lebanon, but it is not the government of Lebanon. So what the world order should adapt, the new reality, is that it should have mechanisms to decide how to act vis-a-vis those entities and, as Sarit said, to enforce them.
Indeed. Unfortunately, we did run out of time. So we will have to hear more from also General Gavish tomorrow in our daily update. And therefore, I'd like to thank you, General Gavish. Colonel Zehavi, thank you also very much for the elaborate explanation about particularly Lebanon, which needs to be dealt with. I think that leadership is making a mistake not to deal with this. There's still too many displaced Israelis, including here in Jerusalem, from northern Israel, that also need to be treated in a humanitarian fashion. Where are the international outcry for that? Unfortunately, we're not hearing that to date. Thank you also, Mr. Oren. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem this evening, our regular bulletin of TV7 Israel News at 9 p.m., followed by our Jerusalem studio geostrategic panel at 9:30. Until then, shalom.
My name is Oren. I used to be Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of Israel, currently Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a think tank, and the editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. For the last few years, I've been a regular panelist for TV7, a fantastic opportunity to bring deep and analytical perspectives to the debate over regional affairs, Israeli affairs, international affairs, in the company of some of the best minds in Israel.